As I mentioned, we're going to start early today and just roll because we've got our young men need to be out. Guys, what time do you have to exit by? 8:30. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start this program now. Our topic today is going to be Catholics in America, Catholics who have served our nation in times of war. We're going to cover the periods from the War of 1812 to the Second World War, but to kind of just remember what we talked about last time was really from the time of the Constitution until the Plenary Council in Baltimore of 1852. And if we remember, at the time of the Constitution, we had a population just under 3 million people, about 500,000 of which were enslaved. And of the 3 million people, less than 1% were Catholic population. That just kind of gives us some bookend to move from. By the time the Plenary Council took place in Baltimore in 1852, we'd seen rapid expansion for Catholics that had immigrated, particularly as a result of the Napoleonic Wars going on in Europe, which forced the migration of many Catholics leaving continental Europe that came to the New World. We also went through the Louisiana Purchase at that time, which effectively doubled the size of the country. And so by the time of 1852, when the Plenary Council was established, we had 5 dioceses taking care of the population in the United States that were Catholic at that time, which was roughly 7% of the population. So in that short period of time of 60 years, we'd gone from 1% to 6%. And at that point, the Catholic population was the largest single religious denomination, although Catholicism is not a denomination, but the single largest religious group in the United States by population were Catholics. So it was a time of rapid migration, a lot of change, a lot of movement, a lot of change throughout the world, and things were starting to percolate. So we're going to talk a little bit about the major wars throughout the United States, starting with the War of 1812 and going through the Second World War, because as you see it, as we go through, you're going to get a story of tremendous rapid growth in terms of U.S. population and Catholic participation in that population as well. Remember, the saying, demographics is destiny. So whenever you've got a number of people, you have to take a look and say, all right, what's the game inside the game? It's one thing to have a lot of people, but what's moving the culture in terms of the types of people that they are, the age of the population, the gender of the population, where they come from, the culture, etc. So demographics is destiny. And as we move through this revisit of Catholics engaged in wartime, what did that mean to the overall American culture as a broader? That's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Okay, America at war, 1812. What's happening in 1812? Why does the United States, a brand new fledgling country, go to war with Great Britain, who they had just declared independence from? Well, some interesting things are happening in the culture. Number one, the British aren't too happy with the fact that America won its independence. So they're picking on our seamen, our merchant seamen who are trading with European nations. And what would happen when a British ship of war would come across an American flagged vessel in that time period between the Revolution and the War of 1812? Anybody have a feel for it? What would happen if a British ship of war was involved in the Napoleonic War, who was embargoing all the ports in Europe that America wanted to trade with, and if they came across an American flagged vessel, what would happen to that vessel?
Shoot down.
It would be seized as a war prize so that they could take the ship. Didn't belong to them, but they took it. And then what would they do with the sailors, the company of people that were operating that ship? What do you think would happen with the American seamen that were on that American flagged vessel? Robbie?
Impress them into the Navy.
What does impressment mean?
They took them and forced them to join.
They took them into the British fleet and turned them into British sailors, okay? Now, that was something that America, this fledgling new country, couldn't really stand. So they're like, Britain's picking on us because, you know, they've got the Napoleonic wars going on and they've got their fleet all around the world. So they're seizing our ships, they're taking our citizens, they're embargoing our trade, the ability to do economic. So you know what? That's a cause for war. And so the United States declared war, and we went to war with Great Britain. Now, we just beaten these guys, but now we're going to have a real fight because now it's going to be a seafaring fight. Now, what happened in the War of 1812 historically? We know that they sailed into Baltimore Harbor, and during the bombardment of Fort McHenry, something happened. What was that? We sing it before the baseball games. What is it? Exactly, the national anthem was written, a poem by Francis Scott Keyes. They came into our harbors, they bombarded our forts, and you know what? They even went into our nation's capital. And what did they do? They burned the White House, exactly. So this was a serious, serious war. Now again, there's not a large Catholic population at that particular time. But remember, during the year 1810, something happened. Napoleon made a great land deal with Thomas Jefferson, and what happened? The Louisiana Purchase. It doubled the size of the United States in terms of territory, stretching all the way up the Mississippi River Valley, from the Great Lakes down to the city of New Orleans, the Mississippi River included. And that gave us territorial government over a population that was sparse, but it was largely culturally Catholic, particularly because of the exploration of the French explorers down the Mississippi River Valley and the establishment of the port city in New Orleans, but also the Spanish territory of the Floridas and southern Georgia, because the Spaniards had evangelized that time period in the preceding 200 years. So all of a sudden, the Catholic population in America is growing large. Now, we're in the War of 1812, which lasts from 1812 to 1815. And after the Treaty of Paris took place, another battle took place in the War of 1812, even though it was after the war. Does anybody know where that battle took place? New Orleans, the Battle of New Orleans. Now, this is a significant moment in Catholic history because the American forces at that time period were under the command of a general. Does anybody know who the general who commanded the American army at New Orleans was? Philip? Andrew Jackson, right, himself. And so he came into New Orleans, and the British are looking to siege the city of New Orleans. So what he did with the citizenry of New Orleans, who were largely French culturally or Spanish culturally or African culturally, because New Orleans had been a city for over 200 years at that particular time period. So you had a population that were newly American, and Andrew Jackson had to convince them that service and defense of the city was in their interests, and this was a largely Catholic population. The citizenry rallied, they supported the armed conflict there in terms of supporting their city, and they defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans, even with the help of a certain guy named Jean Lafitte. Does anybody know who Jean Lafitte is? The pirate, exactly. So it was this unique time period in American history where even though it was outside of the time of war, the treaty had already been settled, but a Catholic participation in the War of 1812, particularly at the city of New Orleans and the battle there, was significant. So that's why we're going to say thank you to all of those who served our country in that particular time, 1812 to 1815. The next major war that takes place in the United States happens in the war with Mexico, 1846 to 1848. Okay, so a little over 30 years later, America's again at war. 1846 to 1848, the war with Mexico. Now this is an interesting one. Population in the United States at that particular time period of 1846 was 22 million people total. Of that, 7% are Catholic, 1.5 million. 22 million, 7% Catholic population. The United States has declared war with Mexico. Mexico is a fairly newly established republic at that time period, having declared their independence from Spain. But what religion do you think the majority of Mexicans were? Catholic. What religion were the majority of American population? Not Catholic. 7% Catholic population, most of which had newly arrived as migrants from Europe, many of them from Ireland, which was going through a tremendous famine at that time period. They arrived in Boston, they arrived in Philadelphia, they arrived in South Carolina, they arrived in New York. So you're newly arrived Irishman that's come to this new country, and your country has declared war with the Catholic nation in Mexico. So you have a question. Am I a Catholic American or am I an American Catholic? Many of the Irish in New York City went and joined the Mexican forces. It's a little known part in our history, but they were traders who joined the Mexican army and established an Irish brigade that served in the Army of Mexico, and those guys were called the Patricios. the patricios, okay? They served under the Irish flag in unity with Mexico in opposition to the United States of America. Now, the American army knew they had a problem. If these newly arrived Catholics were going to side with Mexico, we need to do something to it. And so it was an opportunity that the United States Army saw, and that was to establish an official chaplain corps for Catholics. And so for the first time in the American Army, the Army staffed and paid for and welcomed Catholic priests into the Army. The first official Catholic chaplains who served in the United States Army were in the army of General Zachary Taylor. Remember, there were two particular armies that were fighting Mexico. One was under the command of General Taylor, the other one in the command of Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott went to the Battle of Veracruz and then conquered Mexico City. General Zachary Taylor primarily operated in Texas, Arizona, and Alta California. But in General Taylor's army, Father John McElrath, a Jesuit priest, was the first American Army Chaplain Corps, and Father Anthony Reyes, who himself also was a Jesuit. So two members of the Society of Jesuits were the first chaplains to serve in the United States Army under the army of Zachary Taylor. Father Reyes, by the way, was killed in action. He was KIA, so that's our first chaplain to have been sacrificed in a time of battle. So again, the war with Mexico was really a time period where we're seeing this tension between largely Protestant-controlled elites who are in government, who are in politics, or in the army, or in the leadership positions. The newly arrived immigrants are kind of the unwashed and unlettered, and a lot of them are, just illiterate, and so they're just finding their way in the new America. So that war with Mexico was an incredible one in terms of Catholic integration into the broader culture. After the war with Mexico was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States received territory in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Alta California, Colorado, Nevada, Wyoming territory, Nebraska. So again, it largely expanded the territory under the United States at that time period, and what was a policy called Manifest Destiny. The policy of the government was that there should be one United States of America from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. We established the border with Mexico and the border with Canada. So now largely the continental United States is starting to come into shape. Those plain states and the Northwest weren't states yet. They were still territories, but they are under the leadership and governance of the United States. Now, the next major war is called the Plains Indians War, 1850 to 1870. Now, the Catholic participation in this is interesting. General Philip Sheridan, does anybody ever heard of General Philip Sheridan? Catholic. He was the United States Military Academy graduate. Now remember, this is a time when Catholic persecution was significant. It was difficult for Catholics to be accepted into society, and particularly to be receiving a congressional appointment to go to the military academy. General Sheridan was from a Ohio Catholic family, so he was Catholic from his cradle. So for him to be accepted into the United States Military Academy at West Point was a significant accomplishment. But he demonstrated himself as an officer, as a leader, and a lot of his early service was in the plains, leading the American Army in the Plains States in the battles. Also Catholics that participate, by the way, later he became a significant cavalry officer during the Civil War, and then later Chief of Staff for the American Army, and then he retired as General of the Army, which is our highest rank in general officership, right? So today we would call that a 5-star general. At that time we didn't have 5 stars, we had what was called General of the Army, which is the highest level of general. Only George Washington had it prior to the Civil War when people were achieved that rank in the Army. Anyway, in 1883 he was Chief of Staff, he retired as the General of the Army. Now another leader who was a Catholic in those Plains Indians War was a guy named Red Cloud. Red Cloud, let's see, what was he named after? Red Cloud was a chief of the Lakota. He was a warrior. Up until the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he had achieved the greatest victory over American forces, where he killed over 83 American soldiers. They were engaged in open warfare. Now remember, the Plains Indians weren't united. There was no real confederation. You had tribalism that was going from the southern border in Texas all the way to the northern border and all the way into the Pacific Northwest. But the warlike Sioux Indians, they're called the Lakota people, were particularly difficult to defeat. They were great warriors, they were tribal nomads, they had a culture of moving across the plains. They didn't have an understanding of land ownership because they migrated with the seasons to where the animals happened to be and where the weather happened to be best for them. So they were very mobile. They were a horse culture. And so when they came into fighting with an American army that was largely following Napoleonic army battle tactics, they were superior. They knew the territory, they were defending their homeland, and they were very independent warriors. Ultimately, that ended up being their undoing because they didn't really work well together in battle. However, Red Cloud was a particularly effective war leader, and so he distinguished himself for his Lakota people defending themselves from the American army that was coming in, largely to expand the railroad. Remember that manifest destiny from the Atlantic Ocean to the what? Because in order to link the country, we needed to lay rail tracks. And so that had to go across the plains. And so this is where we're having this conflict in terms of the Plains Indians. Red Cloud later became a Catholic, largely due to the evangelization efforts of Jesuit missionaries in the Plains States. So General Sheridan, Catholic. Red Cloud, later converted to Catholicism in 1887. There's another Catholic that was a Lakota. His name was Black Elk. Has anyone ever heard of Black Elk? Black Elk's cause for canonization is proceeding. So he's a very interesting man. He was a Lakota medicine man. He was a shaman, a pagan priest, if you will. And he came to understand that this integration between the white man and the red man was part of the Great Spirit's plan for something that was taking place. He converted to Catholicism and then became a lay catechist. Now remember, Plain States at that time period, 1850 to 1870, 1880, not a lot of settled population, not a lot of parishes. There were mostly missionary priests that were on horseback. And so for the Indians who are now being congregated into reservations and then managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a guy like Black Elk was significant in terms of sharing the Catholic faith. In fact, it's interesting, the majority of American Indians to this day are descendants of Catholics because they embraced Catholicism after the Plains and Indians Wars. All right, Plains and Indian Wars, 1850 to 1870. During that time period, something happened that was radically important to the history of this country. It happened in 1861 and went until 1865. Young scholars over here at this table, what took place in the United States between 1861 and 1865? I said the young scholars, Hugh, not the old scholars. All right, the young scholars will remind us that between 1861 and 1865, we have the American Civil War, North versus South. Now, what caused the Civil War? Lots of different reasons. You have a population in the northern states that is largely immigrants from Europe who are working and industrializing in urban America and establishing a mercantile class. The number of population is growing. In the southern states, largely an agricultural-based economy, which was very few people that were able to vote, and a large number of people who were not able to vote, largely Africans, who had been enslaved, who were working on the plantations. And so you have this disparity in terms of number because we are in a monarchy or we're in a representative democracy. Representative democracy. So now you got this issue. There's demographics is what? Destiny. And so the demographics is changing. The northern states, urbanizing, more people, more voters. The southern states, large agriculture, a lot of wealth, but not a lot of voters. We're starting to have a problem. So as manifest destiny starts to expand into the plain states, into the southern states, we have this big question. Are they going to come in as slave states? Or are they going to come in as free states? We have this thing called the Missouri Compromise. So if you're going to bring in states, they're going to come in two at a time. They're going to be equal number of slave states versus free states. And so what this is basically doing is kicking the can down the road for what's going to be a regional conflict between the North and the South, which happens right after the election of Abraham Lincoln. And right after that, there was a little place in South Carolina where there was a federal fort in the harbor called Fort Sumter. Okay, and so in April of 1861, the state of South Carolina fired on federal property at Fort Sumter. Does anybody know who the officer in charge of the original bombardment of Fort Sumter was on the Confederate side? If you said General Pierre Beauregard, you would be correct. Catholic from New Orleans. All right, so a Catholic fired the first shot that happened in terms of starting the Civil War. Now again, let's take a look at the population at that time period. 31 million people in the United States. 10% of them were Catholic. 31%, 10%, which means we have a little over 3 million Catholics at that time period. So Beauregard is in charge of the battery in Charleston, which fires on Fort Sumter. The war effectively has begun. On the southern side, another Catholic who led troops. In fact, Beauregard later then went on to victory for the Confederate States of America in the first American engagement, which was at the first Battle of, unless you're from the South, in which case it's the first Battle of Manassas. All right, so the Southerners call it the first Battle of Manassas. The Northerners call it the first Battle of Bull Run, but it was a victory for the South under the command of that General Beauregard. All right, now, later, another Confederate who serves another general officer who served in the Confederacy was at Gettysburg. Now let's think about this. The war began 1861. Largely, effectively, the South was fighting a defensive war for their own territory. They knew the territory, and while they had less in terms of armaments and munitions and the ability to manufacture war product, what they did was had a highly motivated people to defend their territory and superior leadership. Because of the aristocracy, mostly sent their sons for education at the United States Military Academy at West Point, or to the Virginia Military Academy, or any of the state military academies. They had superior leadership in the South when they organized their army. In fact, many of the general officers that served in the Confederate States of America had established their wartime credentials during the war with Mexico and during the Plains Indians War. And so when they had to decide whether they were going to come in for the North or the South, many of them joined their states' armies, and they became members of the Confederate States of America. 11 independent states that were trying to unify in opposition to what they saw as unions, a union that they no longer wanted to be part of, and that the Grand Army of the Republic, or the Army of the Potomac, was invading their land. So in the first 2 years of the war, largely the South was prevailing. One of their strategies was, if we want to bring a quick end to the war, we need to break the will of the Northern people. And the way to do that is to capture Washington, D.C. And so Lee tried to invade Washington on 3 occasions. The last occasion was the Battle of Gettysburg. Battle of Gettysburg, the Southerners engaged with the Northerners in western Pennsylvania. The first day, South had the stronger of the 2 days. Second day was really the day that they wanted to break the will. Now, for those that studied the Battle of Gettysburg, they know that this is really the turning point in the Civil War. And historians are still debating it. What if the South had broken the Union line at Gettysburg? Well, they would have prevailed and then they would have been able to come in and capture Washington. Lee, who's in command of the troops, is asking General Longstreet to send his troops across the Peach Field, across the open plains towards the Peach Fields. And Longstreet is like, General, there's no way I can bring up my troops in this time period. This is going to be a slaughter of the American people, or of our people. I don't want to do it. Okay. Big question. Did Longstreet was Longstreet quick enough to obey Lee's orders, or was it because Longstreet delayed that the South was defeated on the second day, and then the third day they had to retreat? It's a big question. Longstreet, Catholic. Longstreet largely viewed in the South negatively for that reason. But Longstreet spent the post-war period of time trying to reestablish unity between the former Confederate States and the Union for reconciliation. In fact, he even later served in government representing the southern states. So General Longstreet, Catholic. An admiral in Confederacy was Raphael Semmes. Now, the Confederate States of America had a navy, and for those that maybe follow a little bit of military history, we understand there was a naval battle fought between 2 new technologies called ironclads. Does anybody know what an ironclad ship is? Fabio, I know you do. What's an ironclad, Richard?
Well, that's where they put iron on the side of their ship.
Exactly.
And, you know, up to that time, the South had controlled the Mississippi.
That's right.
But that ship, I think it was in Iowa where they built it, just destroyed the whole.
So the ironclads were this technological advancement that happened during war period. Okay, so the Confederate States of America had an ironclad. The Union Army or Navy had an ironclad. Admiral Raphael Semmes was a Catholic who commanded the Confederate States of America's Navy. In the Union, again, Philip Sheridan, who we talked about a moment ago, was Grant's cavalry officer who was in charge, radically effective war leader. William Rosecrans was the general in charge of the Army of the Potomac after General McClellan was fired by President Lincoln. Rosecrans, ineffective in terms of his command of it, but a Catholic. Later came to California where if you ever go into Los Angeles and you go down Rosecrans Boulevard, that's named for General Rosecrans. He served here in the port of Los Angeles. Okay, 1861, 1865. Interesting date. The war ended effectively with Lee's surrender at where? What day of the calendar liturgically did that happen? Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday of 1865, the war effectively ends. Good Friday of 1865, the President of the United States decides that he's going to go and take an entertainment at Ford's Theater. What happened on Good Friday, 1865? Got shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth. He dies on Holy Saturday after suffering through the night. So again, you have to kind of see what's happening in terms of these dates and people that are involved. Okay, the next major war after the Civil War, and the Civil War was radical. In fact, George Will, the political commentator, says if you want us to understand America, you need to understand two things. One, the Civil War. What was the cause, what was the effect, and what happened technologically, what happened in terms of population migration, what happened in terms of effective leadership, ascendancy in terms of military training. But then you also need to understand baseball. George Will says, if you want to understand America, you need to understand the Civil War, and you need to understand baseball. Why do you think that is? When was baseball invented? Right after the Civil War, right? Okay, and then it expanded throughout our states. And then if you follow baseball, you'll start to see that there's a tradition that's handed on from father to son in terms of records and scorekeeping and how professional sports starts, how people gather for entertainment, how we lionize our athletes. Even to this day, I was just down in Arizona, first time ever I went to spring training. I was amazed at the number of people that go to Arizona for the Cactus League games. Florida, the same thing down in the Grapefruit League. Baseball and the Civil War, two things that are worthy of study if you want to understand America today. So says George Will. All right, the next major war, Spanish-American War, 1898. America's starting to ascend. We now have 74 million people. Catholics represent 14%. So we have 12 million Catholics. We've gone from 3.5 million to 12 million in 30 years. Think about that in terms of parishes that need to be built, schools that need to be built, people that need to be served. So now we're at the war with Spain. Thanks, guys. Have a great retreat. Appreciate what you're doing today. So the war with Spain takes place over a 6-month period of time. Cause of the war, still debatable, but effectively what happens is the United States takes its fleet, sails to the Philippine Islands, and defeats the Spaniards not only at the Philippines, but also in Cuba. So at the end of the war with Spain, American territory expands a great deal, again, particularly into the Pacific Ocean. So now we have a territory that we're responsible for in the Philippines, which are largely Catholic. We have islands in Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, largely Catholic. And we have outposts between the Pacific coast of California all the way to the Philippine Islands that came as a result of that war. So we vastly expand the American territory, the American reach, but now we're in the Pacific location, and American power is starting to ascend. 1898. Catholics who served in the war, Spanish-American War. Father John Chadwick served as the chaplain on the USS Maine. The USS Maine was anchored in Havana Harbor. It was the sinking of the USS Maine that was largely the cause, the match for the war with Spain. Father Francis Duffy, the Fighting 69th. Father Francis Duffy is an Irish Catholic priest from New York. And again, remember how that anti-Catholic animus is there in the culture. It's very strong still in the United States at this time period. And so Father Duffy joins the American Army as the chaplain for the Fighting 69th, which is largely known as the Irish Brigade. Remember, we talked about the war with Mexico. Where was the Irish Brigade at that time? Serving against the United States of America. Now in 1898, the Irish Brigade is serving with the American Army proudly, and they have their own chaplain, Father Francis Duffy. Later, he goes to serve in World War I. If you go to Times Square in New York City, you're going to see a statue of a Catholic priest. It is Father Francis Duffy. All right, so we've got Father Duffy serving in the Spanish-American War. You've got John Chadwick, who's a priest who was the chaplain on the USS Maine in the Navy. Fighting took place in Cuba. Victory brought us American territory all across the Pacific. Small, short war, but significant in projecting American power. Also, it's a time period where we saw tremendous growth in terms of population. The next major American war takes place in World War I. Now, this is a little tricky. The First World War began in what year? 1914. America gets in what year? 1917. U.S. population at that time period, 103 million. So from 1898, we've gone from 74 million to 103 million. Catholic population is now 17% of the United States total. We have over 17.5 million Catholics in the United States in 1917. All right, which Catholics served during the First World War, which is taking place largely in France and in Belgium? Trench warfare. America gets into the end, turns the balance of power. Because of the United States getting into the war in 1917, there's a new technology that's taking place at that time period. The Air Force, the Army Air Corps. There were American volunteers that had served in Europe before America got into the war, largely as pilots. They were part of a thing called the Lafayette Escadrille. So they went and volunteered for France, largely by going through Canada and joining either the British RAF or the French Air Forces with Americans serving in both of those. A guy by the name of Eddie Rickenbacker, if you've ever heard of that name. He's a German, I don't think he was a Catholic, but Eddie Rickenbacker was the first American ace serving in the First World War in a new technology, which was the air fighting, dog fighting. You probably heard of a guy who was known as the Red Baron, right? He was on the German forces. So America gets into the war, turns the tide of the battle, largely because the Russians had left the warfare because of the revolution that's taking place in Russia. And so Germany sued for peace, and you have this Treaty of Versailles in 1918. Who served in that war on the American side? The last casualty of the war, Catholic priest. The last casualty of the war for the United States, American Catholic priest, Father William Davitt. He was killed in action on 11/11/18. Now the armistice went into effect at 11 a.m. on the November 11th. The armistice went into effect. At 9:35 a.m., Father William was killed by a German artillery shell in the Argonne Forest after he had posted and saluted the American flag. So an American chaplain serving in the Argonne Forest, which is some of the most brutal fighting in the First World War, is posting the American flag, saluting it, and a German artillery shell comes over and kills him. He was a graduate of Holy Cross University. He was a member of the football team. Now remember, American football at that particular time wasn't like the football that we know now in the NFL, which is like largely touch football, right? The young guys are all gone. So any of the records that Tom Brady has set are not records, okay? Because the rules have been changed to protect the quarterback. And these days, the football that these guys played in 1910, 1905 was so brutal that the President of the United States at that time, Theodore Roosevelt, convened a national summit to say, we're going to civilize this game because too many of our young guys are literally getting maimed on the field. So Father William Davitt, as an undergrad at Holy Cross, was one of those types of football players. They used the leather helmets. These guys were tough men. Okay, so in his particular unit, He previously had personally saved 40 men in his unit in the Battle of the Vesle River. He was decorated by the French government with the Croix de Guerre. He was also a Knight of Columbus. This guy, Father William Davitt, Holy Cross priest, incredibly strong. 125th Regiment, he served in the 125th Regiment in the 32nd Division. His story is worthy of just write it down, Father William Davitt, amazing guy. All right, another Catholic that took place is a guy named Colonel William Donovan, known as Wild Bill. Wild Bill Donovan, Catholic out of New York, served on the staff of General Douglas MacArthur. Name worthy of remembering, Colonel William Donovan, First World War. In the Second World War, he was called on to set up a new division in the American Army. It was called the OSS, the Office of Special or Secret Services, what we now call the CIA. Bill Donovan was the father of the CIA, served in the First World War under General Douglas MacArthur. 16% of the American expeditionary forces that served in the First World War were Catholic. 16%. The Knights of Columbus in particular distinguished itself because as an order, it established an organized effort to establish what are known as canteens or recreational facilities for soldiers in battle to be able to get off the line, get refreshed, have some donuts, have some coffee, have a place just to rest and get away from the battle fatigue. But also they established catechesis through Catholic information, chaplains that would serve. So the Knights of Columbus in the First World War really made a big effort. Jeff, the order was founded by McGivney in what year?
1882.
So from 1882 now to 1918, just 20 short years, it goes from an idea from a Catholic priest in a basement of a Catholic church to now serving the United States forces, serving in the First World War with the canteens and the chaplain corps, Catholic information. So it's a major leap forward in the Knights of Columbus as a service to the American people. All right, 1917 to 1918. The population was at 103 million. All right, we're going to move into the Second World War, which is a particularly important thing. We said you had to remember the Civil War and baseball if you want to understand America, but if you really want to understand global politics, you need to understand the Second World War because it's the transition from the old world into the new world and American ascendancy in terms of its dominance. In 1939, our population is 132 million people. 1939, it's 132 million people. 1918, it was 103 million people. So we go from 103 to 32. Doesn't seem like a large growth in terms of population, but remember what was happening in the world in 1929 through 1939? Great Depression. Nobody's going anywhere. Okay, it's just locked down. If you were an American living in the United States in 1932, you were probably living on a farm. 32% of our population were farm living and or working. A large rural population, but you weren't going anywhere. The unemployment during the Great Depression was 25%.
And don't forget the growth of socialist oppression.
We'll come back to them in a minute. 25% unemployment at a time when only men were counted as employable. So effectively, you're talking about 35, 40, 45% unemployment, which gave rise to what Jeff just alluded to, which was the rise of the philosophy of Engels and Marx, which became known as communism, which in a light way became socialism that infected many of our liberal elite in the New York City progressive era, particularly. And so they worked their way into the United States government. So we've got a kind of a fight for our soul as a nation taking place during the Great Depression. In fact, we almost here in California elected a socialist governor for the first time. Does anybody know who that guy was? The author Upton Sinclair. He stood for governor in 1936, I think it was. And he was so popular at that time because the ravages of the Depression were so significant that Republicans and Democrats in California came together as an electorate in order to defeat Upton Sinclair, the socialist. Interesting times for politics. All right, 1939, the war begins. Wait a minute, 1939? I thought it was 1941. Now this is important. How many people are in America? 132 million. Of the 132 million, 17% are Catholics. It's 21.5 million people. This is the ethnic breakdown of the people that are Catholic in the United States in the largest percentages. German Catholics, 9%. Italian Catholics, 9%. Irish Catholic, 5%. So 23% are either from Italy, Germany, or Britain. They have one thing in common. What do they all hate? Great Britain, all right? So the Germans are already at war in 1939. The Italians are allied to the Germans in 1930 and the Irish just hate the British because of the dominance of what happened in terms of the crushing of the Irish by the British in the preceding 250 years. So they're like, we're not going back to war in Europe for people aligned to Great Britain. Not happening. Catholics we served in the First World War. This is just an extension of what took place before. These guys will never get along. This is largely about kings and monarchs and all this stuff. We don't want anything to do with it. That all changed on December 7th, 1941. What happened on December 7th, 1941? So the Empire of Japan, which was allied to Germany, decided that they were going to attack Pearl Harbor and drop bombs and sink the fleet that was at Pearl Harbor. They thought that was a good idea. What day was it? December 7th. All right, the next day, the President of the United States gives a speech before Congress and says, yesterday, in the island of Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan effectively declared war. We're at war. What day is the day after December 7th?
Immaculate Conception.
Boom. So the war effectively starts on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Who's our national patroness? The Immaculate Conception. Interesting how this works. So now the most amazing thing happens. Not only are we at war with Japan, but then the guy that's in charge of Germany decides, well, let's declare war on the United States. Something that Roosevelt had wanted to happen, but because of the population, the ethnic makeup of the Catholics that were from Germany, Italy, or Britain, now he had a war taking place not only in the Pacific, but a war taking place in Europe. All right. Small known fact, Len will like this one. December 8th, 1941, the president has to go to Congress to make an address. But there was a previous meeting that was on schedule, on the books already at the White House for December 8th, 1941. A woman who is a progressive activist from New York had effectively allied herself in friendship with the First Lady of the United States of America, whose husband previously was the governor of New York. And so that progressivism that was taking place in the Democratic Party that Jeff alluded to in terms of socialism had worked its way through. The person that was meeting on December 8th with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States, on the day that America is going to war, she thought this meeting was so important that we're going to keep it on the books because I want the Department of Health and Human Services to meet my good friend from New York. And we're going to have a meeting to talk about her ideas and her plans. This is happening on December 8th, 1941. Does anyone know the name of that woman? Margaret Sanger, founder of International Planned Parenthood. Talks about how the devil, the divider that Father was talking about today in Mass, is working his way in. The entire world is about to change, yet it's so important that Margaret Sanger come into the White House to have an appointment not only with the First Lady, her friend, but more importantly for the First Lady of the United States to tell the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, we're going to implement her policies, and we think this is a good idea. That's the beginning of how Planned Parenthood International starts to infiltrate the American government. It is an absolutely brutal moment in American history.
With the Germans, by the way.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about some Americans of distinction that served during the Second World War. Now remember, Catholic population in America at that time is 16% of the overall population. The overall population is 132 million, 16% of Catholics. The armed forces between 1941 and 1945 went from a standing army of less than 400,000 people to over 16 million men and women being recruited, trained, outfitted, armed, uniformed, fed, mobilized to theaters, moved around. It was the most amazing social development in terms of mass migration of people in the history of the world. The number of people that were involved in the American military during the Second World War that were Catholic, 25%. We're 16% of the population, but 25% of the people in uniform are Catholic. This is the moment when Catholics really break through that anti-Catholic bias. Because remember we said in the preceding 10 years, nobody went anywhere, right? So if you were living on a farm as a Catholic in Minnesota, what are the chances that you're going to ever meet a Jew from Brooklyn or a black man from Mississippi? Not going to happen because you're not going anywhere. But if all of a sudden you guys are training at bases in Mississippi or in Louisiana or in Georgia, all of a sudden the mass migration of people, this is really the beginning of the civil rights movement, because all of a sudden we're starting to say, hey, his blood's the same as my blood. We both bleed. If we're in a foxhole, there's no atheists. There's also, we're all brothers. We're all together. So this war has an impact on society. 25% of the Catholics served in it. All right. Somebody that's absolutely got an amazing story is Father Philip Hannon, later Archbishop Philip Hannon, Archbishop Emeritus Hannon of the city of New Orleans. But he served in the paratroopers as a chaplain. He parachuted into Normandy on D-Day. He's got a great book called The Bishop Wore Combat Boots. If you ever want to read that book, phenomenal. So Archbishop Philip Hannon served in the United States Army as a chaplain in the paratroops. These are the toughest of the tough guys. I mean, who in the right mind would ever jump out of a perfectly good airplane into a hot LZ? I mean, this is what these guys were doing. And he was there serving his guys as a chaplain. Heroic man. This is one that's kind of interesting here in Orange County. Father William McGuire, Holy Cross priest, right, CSC. He was a United States Navy chaplain serving in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, celebrating Mass on the fantail of his ship. He coined the phrase, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, okay? He served out his retirement as chaplain at St. Catherine's Military Academy in Anaheim. So again, we owe a great deal to Father McGuire. The chapel over there, the St. Thomas Aquinas Chapel, is dedicated in his memory. An American family contributed a great deal. The Sullivan family, they were the ones that had 7 sons that all went down on the same ship, right? 7 sons from Iowa, Catholics, the Sullivans. Another family that gave a great deal was the Kennedy family. Now, at that particular time period, Joseph P. Kennedy had been the ambassador to the court of St. James in the 1930s. So that meant his older children with him in London. These were as an elite Catholic family at a time when it was very difficult to be an elite Catholic, but Joseph P. Kennedy had established his fortune and sent all of his sons to the right preparatory schools in order to get them into Harvard, which was the key to ascending in the American aristocracy at that time period. Roosevelt had assigned Joseph P. Kennedy, who was a political rival of his, he assigned him as ambassador to the court of St. James. Kind of an FU to the British. We're going to take an Irishman and we're going to make him the ambassador to the court of St. James. Joseph P. Kennedy did not distinguish himself because he was largely seen as someone who was saying America should not get into the war with Germany because there's just no way we can beat these guys. So Roosevelt took advantage of that and really sullied Kennedy's reputation as a political rival, calling him an appeaser, right? So Kennedy's sons needed to redeem his father's reputation, and so Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. and John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Robert Francis Kennedy all joined the American forces during the war, right? Now, let's talk about the Kennedy brothers. Joseph P. Kennedy was a naval aviator who was assigned to the European theater and was detached to the American Army Air Corps, was involved in long-range bombing of the German homeland. In 1944, he died on a bombing mission to Germany when his plane exploded over Southfield, England. His brother, Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and by the way, it was Joseph P. Kennedy the older who was being groomed for political greatness. That was his entire path. His dad had groomed him specifically to be in a position to become president of the United States. He died. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy, his younger brother, was serving in the United States Navy, the reserve officer, and he was assigned to a new technology at that time period. Remember, we said that during warfare, technological advancement takes place. The First World War, you had aviation was really seen for the first time as a new technology. Well, in the Navy, during the Second World War, these plywood boats that were armed with 50 caliber machine guns and 4 torpedo tubes were a new technology because they were light and they were able to move around in the shoals of the islands that the Pacific Theater was taking place. Those were called patrol torpedo boats, PT boats. And their job was to support the fleet in terms of close combat on shore. It's made out of plywood, has very large outboard engines that were used to fly aircraft. So they were very fast, very light, very mobile, not very defensible, right? So it was extremely hazardous duty to be assigned to a PT boat. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Catholic, was assigned as a PT boat commander. Those of a certain age probably remember the number. What was the number of designation for PT boat? 109, right? I'm sorry the young guys aren't here because this would be great for movie night. Why don't you get PT 109 with Cliff Robertson so they can get some history? But what ended up happening to PT 109 was they were guarding a shipping lane in the Solomon Islands, and a Japanese fleet, a convoy was coming through, and PT 109 was literally sawed in half by a Japanese destroyer that couldn't see them because they were running without lights, et cetera. So John Kennedy, who was in command, he was the skipper of PT 109, went into the water. And now he's in hostile territory, they're in the water, he's injured himself, many of his crew members have been burned by the fuels that are on board. And so Lieutenant Kennedy has to lead his men to an island where they have to hide and evade the Japanese. They have no food, they have no water, they have no supplies. This is where he injures his back, which carries him through the rest of his life. He suffers tremendously from his back injury. But he leads the men and holds them together. It's one of the great moments in American history of heroism. And up until that time period, John Kennedy was really seen kind of as the second son, the happy-go-lucky, the jokester, the guy that really wasn't too serious. This was really a moment in his life that sealed him in metal. Robert Francis Kennedy, the younger, the third brother of the Kennedy brothers, served from 1944 to 1946. So the last year of the war, he served in the Naval Reserve as an able-bodied seaman. What is the lowest level of bilge rat scum in the United States Navy fleet? An able-bodied seaman. That's what Robert F. Kennedy served, and with distinction. He served, by the way, on a newly commissioned ship known as the Joseph P. Kennedy. It's interesting. So the Kennedy family tremendously served our nation during the Second World War. Catholics. Again, we talked about that moment of the Second World War being Catholic ascendancy in terms of acceptance. That 25% of the armed services were Catholic. That is not to be taken lightly. During that time period in the Second World War, obviously, remember we had talked about during the Spanish-American War, the United States received territory. The Philippine Islands wasn't a state, it was a territory. The United States was responsible for it. So the officer who was in charge of the American forces in the Philippines, which was our forward base in the Pacific Theater at that time period, was a guy named General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur's father, who was a recipient of the Medal of Honor during the Civil War, had been the head of the American Army right after the Spanish-American War in 1898 to 1905. He was in charge of American forces in the Philippines. So MacArthur's family had been in the Philippines since the turn of the century. In fact, William Howard Taft, later president, had been Governor General of the Philippine Islands when Arthur MacArthur was the head of the Army at that time period. Later in the 1930s, Douglas MacArthur was dispatched to become the American officer in charge of the U.S. military in the Philippines, and he was charged with establishing a strategy for the defense of the Philippine Islands in case we went to war with Japan. So there was some anticipation that war was going to be taking place. MacArthur was in charge of establishing the plan to save the Philippines. So he's in the 1930s there. Now, the plan in case the Philippines were attacked was pretty simple. There was an island fortress by the name of Corregidor in the harbor. And in case the Philippine Islands fell, the plan was for all military personnel and Filipinos that were aligned to the American Army were to go to Corregidor, where they were going to wait for the American fleet to come to save the day. That was the plan for the defense of the Philippine Islands in the 1930s. What happened in 1941 to the American fleet? We lost the fleet. So now the plan for the Philippines defense is largely out the window. So all of these guys are in Corregidor, they're holding out. The Japanese have conquered the Philippine Islands. All of these guys are there, they're suffering. The Philippines fall. MacArthur was taken by presidential order from Corregidor to Australia, where he establishing a beachhead for waiting for the Navy to rebuild after Pearl Harbor to come. But the guys that were left in the Philippine Islands, and many of them Filipinos who themselves were Catholic, were then, after the Corregidor surrendered, they were then marched through what was known as the Bataan Death March. And they were taken to prison ships that were known as hell ships that were then transported to military prisons that the Japanese administered throughout Southeast Asia and in China and in in Indochina and Indonesia. Brutal, brutal captivity for American POWs in Japan. German POWs, again, captivity. Catholics largely in there being served by chaplains who were holding people together. Medal of Honor recipients during the Second World War of note. This guy has a great story. His name's Father Joseph T. Callahan, Society of Jesuits, a commander in the United States Chaplain Corps. He served on the United States ship Franklin. Medal of Honor recipient, Catholic chaplain, USS Franklin. Has anyone ever heard of the story of the Franklin? I hadn't until last night. I was looking it up. It's amazing. Okay, the big moral question that everyone still is debating is, was it morally licit to drop the atomic bomb on Japan and end the war? That's going to be debated as long as there's people that are going to discuss. But the issue in terms of moral relevancy was the invasion of the Japanese home islands. How many men would it take in order to conquer the empire of Japan if we invaded? 100,000 people, 300,000 people, 500,000 people, 1 million? We don't know. But we know that they were queuing up. After the Battle of Okinawa, they're ready for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The USS Franklin was an aircraft carrier that was at anchor off of the Japanese home islands when it was bombed, and it did not sink, but it was largely wounded with tremendous fire. Hundreds of service members were killed. Father Joseph T. O'Callahan, Society of Jesus, was a math professor at Holy Cross College. He had joined the United States Navy to serve as a chaplain, was on the carrier. He personally rescued over 80 sailors that were on the Franklin that were burning to death. Right? His mobilization of not only fighting the fire, but leading the evacuation, tremendously heroic, to the point where he received the highest military decoration that we bestow, which is the Congressional Medal of Honor. Joseph T. Callahan, priest of the Society of Jesus. After the war, when he's discharged, goes back to Holy Cross, becomes Department of the Mathematics Department till 1956 when he dies. Another Medal of Honor recipient, John Joseph Pearl, Ensign, United States Navy. He received his commission after having graduated from the Creighton University, where he was a member of the Reserve Officer Training Corps, the ROTC. Tremendously committed Catholic, one of 9 children, grows up in Nebraska, joins the Navy. There's something about the Midwesterners that always want to join the Navy. Maybe it's the fact they've never seen ocean. Anyway, he joins the Navy. While he was there, he was serving on the USS LST 375. Now, an LST is a landing service craft. So when you're going to take a beachhead, you're going to use these small landing crafts that are going to run the sailors, soldiers, and Marines onto the beachhead. But you have what's called a landing ship where all of those small craft are until they get into the water and they go like small motorboats that keep 20, 30, 40 guys, a platoon level of people. So Ensign, where'd I go here? Ensign Pearl is in command of the deck when this particular ship is getting ready to deploy what are called smudge pots. Does anybody know what a smudge pot is?
It's like a diesel heater.
So it's a kerosene loaded piece of metal which has a chimney on it, and when you burn the kerosene, it gives off black smoke. And because the black smoke looks like smudge, so when you put them on a landing craft and you take them out to the beachhead, nobody can see who's landing because of the smudge. It was a camouflage tactic. The only problem, kerosene, highly flammable. And so what ended up happening was this smudge pot caught on fire and was in danger of exploding on the ship, and then scuttling the entire ship. And so Ensign Pearl himself took the smudge pot, threw it over the side, saved the ship, and preserved what was then the invasion of Sicily. So he's the only Navy, I know Bill will appreciate this, he's the only Navy personnel to receive the Medal of Honor in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic Fleet during the Second World War. There was only one Navy guy. It was Ensign John Joseph Parle for saving the ship and not impeding the landing at Sicily. All right, so those were some of our Catholics engaged in war during that time period. Second World War, I want to talk about a couple of names, though, that are important. They were formed during the Second World War, but where they really distinguished themselves for our country was in later wars of Korea and in Vietnam. Jeremiah Denton. Jeremiah Denton was a United States Naval Academy graduate of 1947. Now, during the war years of the Second World War, typically it takes 4 years to graduate from a service academy, but during the war they had what were called accelerated classes. And what they basically did was they went to school year-round, and they did 4 years of training in 3 years so that the officers could then be put into either the fleet or into the Army. Jeremiah Denton was in the accelerated class of 1947. Interesting enough, his classmate later became President of the United States, a guy named James Earl Carter. That's a separate story. Anyway, Jerry Denton, during the war years of the Second World War, was attending the United States Naval Academy. He was then commissioned in 1947, served in the occupation of Japan, and then during the Korean War, he was a naval aviator. Now, during the war in Vietnam, the naval aviators were particularly susceptible to being shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Then Captain Jeremiah Denton, a Navy captain, which is equivalent of a colonel in the Air Force or in the Marine Corps or in the Army, Captain Denton, who was leading his squadron, was shot down, and then he was taken to a place of imprisonment in Hanoi, which is the capital of North Vietnam, where he was our longest serving prisoner of war in the most brutal of prison camps known as the Hanoi Hilton. Jeremiah Denton, tremendous Catholic, said it was only the rosary that kept him sane while during his captivity, which was multiple years. And it was his job as the senior commander to keep the other guys in check. They established what was known as the tap code, since they weren't allowed to talk to each other. So using Morse code, they would tap. They would also come up with clever ways to pass notes in the latrine, particularly in the place of waste where the Vietnamese guards would not look. So it was a way that he kept the esprit de corps amongst the prisoners in line. Remember, they weren't able to talk to each other, so effectively they were all in solitary confinement. Now, one of the propaganda things that the Vietnamese wanted to do was they wanted to break the American will at home, and so they would take our prisoners and then we'd make propaganda films. They would torture these guys brutally and then say, hey, if you just make this film, we're going to stop beating you up. We're going to stop, tying your arms in such a way that you'll never walk or throw a ball again. In fact, we'll even give you some extra food. So some people would collaborate. It was the policy of the American POWs not to collaborate. Some did. Jeremiah Denton did something tremendously clever. He said, I'm going to collaborate. I'm going to make one of your war films. Okay, so here's Jeremiah Denton, our highest ranked officer in the Hanoi Hilton, sitting in a chair, holding up a newspaper, talking to the American people, telling them about what a great time they're having at the Hanoi Hilton and what generous people these North Vietnamese Army guys are. But he's doing something kind of weird with his eyes. He's blinking in an odd way. And someone in naval intelligence figured out, wait a second, I know Jerry Denton, he would never collaborate. And then he realizes, what's going on? So they realize he's using Morse code with his blinking. And what he's saying is torture. So he's letting the American people know that the prisoners that are in the Hanoi Hilton are being tortured by the North Vietnamese. Tremendously, amazingly brilliant guy. So in a time of tremendous brutal oppression, Jeremiah Denton, formed during the Second World War at the United States Naval Academy, distinguishes himself in service to our country as a prisoner of war. Another one that was a Catholic who was a prisoner of war at that time period, later shot down after Captain Denton, was James Stockdale. He outranks Jerry Denton, so he effectively takes command of the Hanoi Hilton prison system, and again, establishes tremendous discipline inside. So between Denton and Stockdale, you have these two Catholic leaders, war fighters, who are holding the people together, both American heroes. He received the Medal of Honor, by the way. Admiral Stockdale, Captain Stockdale did later. Admiral Stockdale distinguished himself in the post-war time periods. The Army has also had its own distinction of Catholics that served, who were formed during the Second World War at the United States Military Academy, a guy by the name of Harold Moore, who was commissioned during the last months of the Second World War and was assigned to the paratroopers. And while he did not make a combat jump during the Second World War, he was assigned to training paratroopers in the occupation army of Japan, and then later made combat jumps during the Korean War. During the Vietnam War, he was assigned to a brand new technology called United States Army Air Cavalry. You might have seen the movie We Were Soldiers once. That's his command telling that story. And what they were doing was they were using helicopters to fight the war in Vietnam. So they weren't using so much fixed wing fighters to land, but they would come in with mobilized cavalrymen. So it was like the paratroops, only instead of jumping out of an airplane where they would shoot you, they landed in aircrafts, they got off, and then they fought. And so he commanded the troops at the first Battle of Ia Drang in Vietnam, which was a tremendous success in terms of victory in the battlefield. However, really led to a prolonged war because of military planners misunderstanding the tactics of the North Vietnamese. But that's a different war for a different time. But General Moore, later a 3-star, Catholic, tremendously committed, daily communicant, served 32 years in the United States Army, and he retired as a 3-star general in 1977. So Stockdale, Denton, and Moore, men who were formed during the Second World War that later served our country as Catholics in later wars that we're really not going to discuss at this particular time. One thing I do want to talk about is the impact of Fulton J. Sheen in terms of rallying the home front as a philosopher, a teacher, a radio personality during the 1930s, 1940s, and obviously in the 50s and 60s when it's television technology. But this little book right here, Fulton Sheen's Wartime Prayer Book, if you ever get a copy, it's fantastic. Sophia Press publishes it. And it really goes through, and this was given to every serviceman free of charge for the Knights of Columbus to keep in their uniform blouse, so that in those time periods in between a lot of the military services waiting around, they would not only have books where they could pray, but also the philosophical understanding of what it was that we were fighting for at that particular time, and why the American cause was just in opposition to the philosophies of National Socialism that Jeff was talking about, socialism, which also leads to communism, and why the dictatorial efforts of the Empire of Japan were worthy of fighting as a Christian serviceman. So Fulton Sheen, someone who distinguished himself during the Second World War as well in later times. Okay, we've gone long, it's 9:09. That's the end of our talk today, Catholics in America, Catholics at war from 1812 to 1945. We talked about some of the people that distinguished themselves, but the most important thing that we need to understand is that as American population is arising, Catholic persecution is starting to be eliminated. And when we speak again next month, and our topic's going to be these men called knights, where we're going to be talking about the contribution of the Knights of Columbus into American culture. We're going to talk a lot about what that transition in culture from hostility towards Catholics in the latter part of the 19th century to assimilation to ascendance, which happens in the post-war years between 1945 and really today. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.